While I was making these two fancy boxes, I made quite a few little mistakes. Most of these you can't see on the final product, but with so many of them, I actually made a list of them. And this video is going to be about that. My first little screw up was when I was cutting the mortises in these rails. I know there's two boxes, so I set up the fence to position this workpiece to cut the first mortises, and then I cut them in all 8 pieces. For the next position, cut all 8 pieces and all that. And only after I cut about 4 of these did I realize, actually no, there's 16 pieces because there's 2 boxes and there's a top and a bottom rail. Oops. Later on I realized I'd actually cut one of the mortises slightly off in position. So when I was assembling these boxes, sometimes because they're off differently on the top and the bottom, I just couldn't get these to mate properly. So I had to actually cut a notch out of some of the tenons like that so they could fit in a mortise that was slightly misplaced. When I milled up the material for these slats here, I didn't have enough initially, so I milled up some more, and it turns out when I was cutting the rest of them, I didn't plane these quite to the same thickness, so some of these are maybe 0.5 millimeter thicker than the rest of them, and I only noticed that when I set up the half round router bit to round these things. They just didn't end up symmetrical, some of these, and that was because some of these are thicker. Although in the end product it's hard to tell where the thicker slats are, but that was another screw up. For cutting the tenons on the ends of these things, I made a template for the Panther router. That's this template here, because I pretty much always decide what size the tenon needs to be and then make a template for that. But it turns out one of the pre-made Panther router templates is actually almost exactly the size of the one I made. So if I had thought this through ahead of time, I would have realized I had a template that was pretty much the right size already and just made the design so it uses this template instead of this one. When I routed the tenons on the Panther router, it's best to start routing in the middle so that the router can't tear a piece out. But a few of them I started on the corner, and that caused a few bits to chip out. While I was assembling these sides, I put the tenons into one part, then put the glue on the end, and glued up another rail to go in there. But there's the long ones and the short ones, and one time I actually had a set of 6 tenons, and I put the glue in the other part, and it turns out that was a short one and that wouldn't fit together. So now I had glue on both pieces, but I couldn't mate them. So I had to very quickly put glue in the long rail, put that on there, and then put glue on the end of 5 of those slats and put that in the other one, because once the glue is in there, it's hard to clean out, so it's best to just proceed and glue up. When I was assembling the short sides, I took one of these pieces, this is before I cut the handle holes, put 5 slats in there and then glued another one on the other side. And not until later that I was gluing together the last of these that I realized I had only 2 narrow sides left to put these together with. And then trying to figure out where the wide one went, it turns out I had one of these with 2 wide sides glued together. No problem, I can just rip that down to width, but now I only had 2 narrow sides, and rather than make a new part, I just glued them together. And in fact, this is the one that had the 2 narrow sides, and then I had to glue another piece to the side of that here to get up to the full width that I needed for the wide side. Fortunately, it's really hard to tell that this is actually 2 pieces glued together. Now, really, I should have cut the handle holes in these things before I assembled them, but I was just too keen to get all these things glued up. So it didn't really matter that much because I could just put the whole side on my Panther router to cut this handle hole, but I really should have cut the handle hole first. While routing out these handle holes on the Panther router, I try to go around it in such a way that the bit is deflected inwards, so that the bit deflection in the end doesn't really matter, because on the final pass, when there's almost no forces, it takes care of that. But for one of the handle holes, I went around the wrong way. So this is the size of this handle hole, where I went around it in a direction where the bit gets deflected outwards, and you see that doesn't fit in there even though it fits there. So this handle hole is bigger than the rest of them because I went the wrong way around with the router when I routed on the Panther router. When I cut the handle holes with the Panther router, initially I had the depth stop set too shallow, so the bit wouldn't actually go all the way through. So there was quite a bit of stuff left around the edges, even though the middle part came off. Didn't cut deep enough in there.
That in the end didn't matter very much because I just sanded that away and then I cut the round over around the edges, and that took care of anything that was left. When I set up to cut these joints here, I put 2 saw blades in the table saw and I got all ready to cut the box joints. But what I forgot to do before I did that is to cut all these to their final length. So that was a bit annoying. Fortunately, I have another table saw in the other room, so I just went over there and cut all these to the final length, so I didn't have to take the blades back out of the table saw. When I stacked 2 saw blades in the table saw to make the slots for these box joints, I didn't have quite the right gear combination for that spacing, or none that I really liked, so I figured I'd just put a shim between them like this, but that ended up making no difference at all, because with 2 saw blades like that, the teeth will hit against each other before the middle hits, and so both blades kind of deflect outwards a little bit. So you have to put quite a bit of shim in the middle before the total width of cut actually is bigger, and so that shim was completely pointless. I ended up playing around with more gear combinations to get something that was close, so I didn't really need the shim. But even then, the box joints ended up too tight, and I ended up using a trick to advance the gear just a little bit on the reverse cut to widen those slots a little bit, and that ended up making the fit on these box joints so I could still assemble them. The more critical part of the alignment for these joints is the bottom, because there's the groove for the bottom that fits in here. But I wasn't really thinking about this when I was filming, and actually put the pieces in with this side against the stop. So basically that became my reference edge. And of course, once I'd cut 2 of those pieces, I had to make the rest of them the same. Fortunately, the width of these things was consistent enough that the slots still lined up well enough. If they had been an error, it would have been better to have the error on the top, because I could just shave a little bit off the top if these didn't line up perfectly. But when I cut these box joints and I test fit the first of them together, I found that I hadn't actually cut these quite deep enough. So I actually ended up putting the workpieces back in the jig and cutting them again with a slightly greater depth, which fortunately I got the alignment again just the same way, and that made it so that these were just a tiny little bit proud, which is much better because then you can sand them flush. I hadn't really thought about this before I cut them, but the slats actually extend a little bit further than the depth of the box joints here. And cutting some of these, I made a few extra cuts and cut away pieces of the slats. So you can see there's a bit of a notch missing here. Fortunately, that was only on a few pieces, but even so, for instance here, the first cut actually also cuts into the slat a little bit. So that's another boo-boo. Of course, the solution to that would have been to cut these box joints before assembling with the slats. But if I'd done that, getting the alignment of this joint to this joint consistently accurate would have been very difficult. Of course, what I could have done is to assemble these top and bottom frames first and then made everything together. But that would mean lining up 22 mortise and tenon joints all at once, and that's a bit stressful. But the fact is, the first time I made boxes like that, I had done it that way, and I decided I wasn't going to do that again. And when I assembled the first of these corner joints, I wasn't thinking this through ahead enough, and I didn't have my clamps at the ready to fully close these joints. So this one here has a 1mm gap right here, because it didn't fully close. And while gluing together one of the later joints, I put glue on both ends, this end and this end, to put them together, only to realize afterwards the way I had it, the slot that is for the bottom on this side would have ended up on the outside, and obviously that's no good. So I had to then add glue to the other side of it and then put that together, and then in a real hurry scrape out the glue remains on the other end so I could still glue it together later. I glued 3 sides together of both of these boxes before making the bottoms to go in there. And when I was making these bottoms, I just checked the depth that I cut on the slot, and I realized they were inconsistent. And later I realized they were inconsistent all in the same way, in that each of these slots was deeper on one end than on the other end. And first I thought I'd just been sloppy, but I realized when I was cutting these on the table saw, you can even see it in the video, all of these sides, all 8 of them, have a slight twist on them. And I was pushing them down on the side away from the blade, not on the corner that hit the blade first. And that caused the slot for the bottom to be less deep on this end than on this end for all of them. And how did all these box sides end up with a slight twist to them? It's because these tenons are slightly at an angle. It's not really noticeable if you just look at them, but let me just put this piece on here. And now we look at this, and you notice the gap on here is smaller than on here. These are all a little bit twisted, and because the twist is on both ends, when putting these sides together, that twist doubled for the whole thing. And how did that tenon end up getting on there twisted? Fact is, getting the tenon template on there a little bit crooked, or somehow getting a little bit of twist, is something that I sometimes run into with my wooden Panther router, which is one of the reasons I decided to use the metal Panther router to cut these tenons, to make sure I wouldn't end up with that sort of inaccuracy. And this might have worked out if I had been using this pre-made plastic template, which has got these tabs on the back to make sure it's on there nice and precise. But I made my own template, and it just screwed it on there without actually checking it. And now if I just put a straight edge against the bottom here, you can see it's a little bit higher on this side than on this side. Again, too subtle to notice when you're just looking at it casually, but that template being on there crooked messed up the whole thing. Mind you, this very subtle angle error would have been completely unnoticed if it hadn't resulted in me carelessly cutting the grooves and not realizing these had a twist to them, and the groove being less deep on one end. The fact that these sides are twisted really didn't matter in the end, because when I assembled the boxes, it just forced them straight. So when I glued the first layer of the bottom in there, I added a second layer later, I figured I'd just taper the sides a little bit to make that fit. But then I realized, wait, the bottom side is also tapered. So for the second one, I wisened up and I realized I didn't need to taper it, because with this side being at an angle, and these being at an angle, this is highly exaggerated, I just need a rectangular bottom, and it just needs to be in there at a very slight angle to compensate for the fact that all of these grooves are not the same depth on either end. And these bottoms are made out of just 5mm thick plywood, which would be fine if it was grown-ups using these boxes, but I imagine the kids at some point will end up jumping inside of these boxes, and then I thought maybe that is not thick enough. So I actually added another layer, glued that onto the bottom of the other one, and for that I was able to use up all kinds of scraps. So this piece actually was cut at an angle, and I was able to take the piece that I cut off here and put that here, another scrap here. So good use of scraps that way. So that was a lot of mistakes in this project, but all of them recoverable in a way that you can't tell in the final thing. But I find it funny when people comment that it's so nice that I show all of my mistakes. Far from the truth. I only show a small fraction of the mistakes. It's either mistakes that are kind of interesting or that I figure other people would make, or it's mistakes where I built so much already and filmed it, and then I realized there's a thing that's in there that's wrong. So it's easier to say, oops, I screwed that up, than to actually refilm all those bits with the error in them. But people actually enjoy watching the mistakes. But with this project, the video is going to be long enough already, and I didn't want to look like a complete bumbling idiot, so I decided I'd make a separate video about all the mistakes, because, again, there's a lot of them. And some have asked in the comments, how long did it take to make these boxes? Well, speed was never the goal. When I built this one, the whole idea was to show off my homemade machines, the box joint jig, the tenon jig, and the slot mortising machine. And 11 years later, on these ones, I think I've done quite well, because I've used both Panther routers and the pantograph to put the names in there. The only main tools that I missed using are my bandsaws. I did use those, but I didn't film that, and I didn't use the quick set tenon jig this time because I used the Panther router to make the tenons. And I haven't used my homemade lathe in years. I also missed using that one.